And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. A deep sense of awe came over them all, and the apostles performed many miraculous signs and wonders. And all that believed were together, and had all things common. They worshiped together at the temple each day, met in homes for the Lord's Supper, and shared their meals with great joy and generosity.
Hi, how's it going? Everybody doing well so far? You made it. You made it through the time change. We successfully got here. Welcome to those who normally come to the first service. I'm not saying anything. You made it. You're here. That's good. Welcome to National Jet Lag Week, where apparently we choose to put everybody on jet lag, which is always fun, right? So, hey, how we doing? Good. You can tell I'm serious today because I brought the TV out. Like, we're going for it today. So I got a lot to cover, so buckle up. No, my name is John. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm really excited to be with you guys. Welcome to the beginning of spring break as well. I know for some that are heading out this week, so I hope you have a great, restful week. Can I just pray for our time this morning? Is that okay? You guys good with that? Most of you know I'm kind of weird. Sometimes I pray with my eyes open, just as a reminder that God's present and here with us. So if you want to join me in that, totally cool. But if not, just know that that's why I'm doing it. So God, thank you for who you are. God, I thank you that your story shows us that you're active, that you're present with us. I thank you that your story communicates to us that we can rely on you, we can press into you. Thank you that your story shows us that you're good, that you know exactly what's going on in and around us. And so, Lord, we just pray these next few minutes that you'd give us open hearts to what you have to say. I pray that you'd give us a tenderness just even in our minds, in ears, just open ears to hear what you're speaking to us this morning. And Lord, pray that you just remind us of who you are in these next few minutes. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I want to introduce you to a daughter of mine. Her name is Clara, and she picked up a new sport about a year and a half ago. And she's basically become a competitive rock climber, which is kind of cool. This was actually last weekend. We were at a competition, her first ropes competition up in Chicago. And this is the thing, I'm gonna gloat for a little bit because this is when I get to be the doting dad. This is my 9-year-old, and she's been wanting to do this for a long time. And here's one of my favorite moments is when we're at the gym and she's climbing and she'll jump on a wall, and she knows exactly kind of where her rating is right now because every wall is rated, and she knows kind of where she can climb and what's easy, and then she knows what's hard. And she'll walk up to a wall and she'll know that this is one of the hard ones. Like, this is one that she might not be able to get. And this is the favorite thing is we'll have her clipped in and she'll start climbing up, and you can just see it in her eyes that she's not coming down off this wall until she gets to the top. Like, the determination and the perseverance of hanging from this rope, never worrying about the height. Some of you are already breaking out into cold sweats, I can see it. But never worrying about that, but just having this fierceness in her eyes of like, I'm conquering this wall right now. And she'll be up there for 10 minutes, sometimes maybe longer. One time she was on a wall for 20 minutes and just figuring out where to put her feet and where to put her body in order to pull herself up to the next hold. It's my favorite thing as a dad to watch. I love it every single time. And so last week we went to a competition. In a competition, you're given 5 walls, and you can look around a little bit and see. At this competition, you could look beforehand. You're given 3 chances to climb each wall. Of course, you want to get to the top. And so she dives in. You have 3 hours to do that, which sounds like a long time, but when you have like 30 other people doing this, you wait. And so she climbed the first 3. And she did it, what we call it, if you want to be a really cool climber and use this term, she flashed them, which means she climbed bottom to top, never struggled, did it, no problem. Then she got to Route 4. And Route 4 looked a little bit like this. And there was this really tricky part with a ledge. And this is where your hands are. And your hands have to go from there to there. That gives you any idea of where you're going on this route. And so it's a hard one. And so she got up there, she was already tired, and she gets up to right about here, and she slipped off and fell. After flashing the first 3, you could probably tell what was going through her mind, right? And she came off that wall, and she was mad, and she was sad, and she was frustrated and disappointed, and she was what I will call she was in her head. I go in my head sometimes where I'm battling this story that's going on in my head. Have you ever been in that space where you've been frustrated or disappointed or things aren't playing out? The worst part about this story is actually it kind of got a little bit worse. Her next route that she was climbing was even harder, and she knew that. And so she walked over, and on the way to the next route, she looks at me and emphatically she says, I'm never getting on that route again. She was done. I'm like, okay. So we walk to the next route. She gets roped in, and she's already now in her head. She's telling herself this story of I didn't do it, maybe that I can't do it. And she gets roped in, and she starts climbing, and this is the hardest one of the 5. And she gets a few holds up and slips off of that one. Now you can imagine the story that's going on in her head. And she comes off, and then it became kind of a story for all of us, right? Because she's like, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to go get Jimmy John's and drive the 5.5 hours back. I'm the dad who's in my head like, did I really drive 5 hours for you to quit 45 minutes early? I'm sorry, I know I probably shouldn't be thinking that. Is there any other dads that would have been thinking that? Maybe? Say, okay, anyways. But here's what happened is she took a hot minute. She took about 15, 20 minutes. And then she came around. And she said, okay, my job is just to try it one more time. And she walked up to this route, and she got roped back in, and she started climbing, and she got what's called 2 more zones. There's little yellow tags. Basically, she got 2 more points than what she started as last time. So the route that she said she would never do again, she actually got 2 more points. She came down off the wall, walked to the last route, and got 1 more point on that one, got higher up. And so for me, the win of that day was she got out of that story she was telling herself. She got out of the I can't, I won't, I'm done. She got out of that and overcame it and said, I'm just going to give it 1 more try. She changed the story. She got on it, did 1 more try, placed a little bit higher because of it. And for me, that was the win of the morning. Wouldn't you agree? Like, I think that's a pretty cool thing. And here's the deal. I think you and I do this a lot. We always have these internal narratives that are going on in us. Would you agree? Like, no matter what's going on, there's these stories. And stories are a powerful thing. Stories can unite us, right? We come together for shared experiences. You all have, my guess is everybody in here has that story where you went on that grand adventure with that small group and maybe you almost died or whatever it is. And you have that story to share. And whenever you get together, you share those stories. Stories unite us. They teach us. But then also stories, we get into some of those stories that aren't helpful. We get in those stories where we start telling ourselves and we start living in these stories that when something bad happens, maybe you go down the I can't or I won't, or maybe it'll never be like that story. And I think God knows this about us with stories. It's why we like movies. It's why we like TV shows. It's why we like books, because we love the power of a good story and the power of what it does to move us. And I think it plays out in the story, in the story that we're going to dive into today. But if you know me well enough, you know that every time I like to talk, I like to make the Bible a little bit more accessible. And so I'm going to give you a quick Bible tip. I do this every time. And here's the thing. I think God knows that we love stories so much that he made most of the Bible, or at least half of the Bible, in story form. Let me show you this. So in the Bible is made up of 3 main literary styles. The biggest one is narrative. The Bible is 43% narrative, which means just about half the Bible is in story form. And one of the reasons is because when the Bible was being written, okay, it wasn't published and not everybody had them on, they didn't have them on their phones. They didn't have phones. It wasn't as easily accessible. And so if we told stories and if God revealed himself in story, then it was a whole lot easier for us to remember the story and then continue just telling the story to each other, right? Other parts about it are 33% of the Bible is in poetry. This would include the prophets and the apocalyptic language. And then the other 24% is in discourse, which you could put Paul's letters, which is way more clearer. It's like teaching. It's the letters, it's the law, it's all those things that kind of come at you very clearly. It's all those things that come at you very explicitly. But the narrative isn't explicit. Narrative, you can hear a story and you might not ever hear the point of the story, but you know it, right? If you think of anybody remember the story of the tortoise and the hare? If you know that story, you'll never hear in the story the point of the story that slow and steady wins the race or slow and steady will accomplish what you need to do. But by the time you get to the end of the story, you know what it's teaching, right? And these kind of stories have been around for years. I have 2 just fun ones just to kind of tell us the power of a good story. This one is an old fable that I just want to dig into. It's called The Miser. Fun name, right? So The Miser. sold all his property and bought a mass of gold, which he buried in a secret place to which he made frequent visits of inspection. Someone who had noticed his coming and going found the treasure and carried it off. And when the miser returned and discovered his loss, he wailed and tore his hair in frenzy of grief. That you can feel his pain there, right? I mean, he's losing everything that's important, right? Can you imagine being the one who responds like this? Someone who saw him agonizing after learning the cause said to him, "Don't grieve, my friend. Just take a stone and bury it in the same place and think of it as gold in a vault. Even when the gold was there, you made no use of it." Does that story teach you a lesson? And here's the neat thing is what's being thought of probably on this side of the room is a little bit different than might be what's being thought on this side of the room. We could probably all land on lessons from this story, right? Some of us could read this story and say, amen, yes, that's true. We need to put her, and some people could read this story and say, ouch. That kind of sounds like how I am, right? I mean, we all, to varying degree, this hits us in different ways, because that's what stories do, is they hit us in different ways. I got another one. This is a really funny one. This is actually a Jewish parable that comes out of a question that was being asked. I'll tell you the question in just a second, but I'll read the parable first. So this is an old Jewish parable. This one's not in the Bible, just so you know. It'd be funny if it was, though. The donkey and the fat man. Such a good story, right? There once was a fat man riding on a donkey. The fat man was wondering, when can I get off the donkey? The donkey was wondering, when will he get off of me? When the time came for the fat man to get off, you got to include that, right? I don't know which one was more glad. Isn't that fun? Do you know what question was being asked that this story was the illustration? I know no one knows. I just wanted to see what you guys would say. The question being asked was, who was happier when Israel left Egypt? Because Israel left and escaped escaped slavery. Egypt left and escaped the plagues. So the question being asked here is, who was happier when Israel left Egypt? And this was the story that they used to illustrate they didn't really know. Isn't that cool? This is a neat piece of like rabbi tradition that I love, is the idea to ask questions and tell stories to enhance those, to enhance the stories, or to enhance the like understanding of it. And I think that's what we encounter today. So today we're diving back into Acts, where we've been for a little while, and we heard from Stephen last week when you saw Jake Franzik talk on behalf of Stephen. And what I want to do is I want to talk about his story for a second longer, because I'm going to look at what he says to this group. To give you an idea of the story, Stephen is our first Christian martyr, first documented one. And what he's being charged with, and he is given a chance to stand in front of the council and give basically his defense. Now, his defense is 53 verses long. I'm not going to read it all to you, because if I read it all, it takes about 7 minutes or so, and it's going to feel a little bit long. So what I've done is I've picked a couple specific passages of it, so you get the idea of where he's going. But I just want you to see where he goes. If he's standing in front of the council to give a defense of what he's doing and what he's talking about, my thought would be is that he would start with Jesus. Because when you start with Jesus, you get to talk about a Messiah who was just crucified and who rose from the dead, and I think that's a very powerful story. He doesn't do that, though. He goes back a whole lot further, and he includes a bigger story than I think maybe what you and I would have done. So what I'd love to do is talk through his defense and then maybe call out today a part of God's story that I think gets overlooked. Does that sound good? You guys good with that? Thanks, appreciate it. All right, here we go. Then the high priest asked Stephen, "Are these charges true?" To this he replied, brothers and fathers, I can read. Listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham while he was still in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. "Leave your country and your people," God said, "and go to the land I will show you." So he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. After the death of his father, God sent him to this land where you are now living. He gave him no inheritance here, not even enough ground to set his foot on. But God promised him that he and his descendants after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no child. God spoke to him in this way: "For 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated." That's going back to that Egypt part of the story. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, God said, and afterward they will come out of that country and worship me in this place. Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, or a new Pharaoh, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. We're skipping ahead. So then Moses led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the wilderness. Our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. It had been made as God directed Moses, according to the pattern he had seen. Having received the tabernacle, our ancestors, under Joshua, brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. So Stephen stands in front of a council, and literally his life depends on it. Instead of using, I think, what one of the biggest challenges he could of, we're looking at the Christ who was buried, who rose again, we're looking at that story play out. What he does is he stands there and says, hey, let's go back and talk about the whole story of God. Let's talk about the very beginning of Judaism and see what God has done through it. And today, I would like to just call out a characteristic of the story that I think gets overlooked. And I think if we examine it, it gives us an understanding of who God is in maybe a new way. So I'm going to do that the nerdiest way that I have ever done it before. I'm about to become, most of you who know me, you already know I'm an Uber dork. I will own that. But I'm about to be way nerdier than I've ever been on a Sunday morning. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you a map. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Ready? Who's excited about a map? All my agriculture guys, you guys might actually like this. Everybody else is like, what are you doing? I know, I'm going out on a limb here. Okay, so are you ready? I want you to see this just for a second, because here's the deal. In this map is basically where most of the whole Old Testament plays out. Okay? Like 92%, or sorry, like even closer, can I go over here? 92% of the Old Testament plays out like right here. It's not even that big. And then if you add the New Testament, you just add Rome, which is like right here. And that's the the Bible. Like that's the Bible land right there. Isn't that interesting? And to give you a couple other thoughts is, so Jerusalem's right here. Israel, that takes place right here. That's only about the size of New Jersey. Did you know that? It's not a huge piece of land. And so what I'd love to do is I'd love to talk through what Stephen just talked through in his story. Because do you guys remember where Abraham started? Ready? Bible trivia. Where did he start? Super easy. You could moan and get the answer right to that question, okay? And so it was that was an easy one. You could burp and get that answer right. It was so easy. So Abraham starts in He's down here, okay? And so then we head up. So now, a couple key points. Mesopotamia, this area is what's known as commonly called the birthplace of modern civilization. If you look at where like the story of the Garden of Eden takes place, it's usually right in this area between these two rivers. And so Mesopotamia is here, Babylon's here, which Babylon is the kingdom that took Israel basically into exile halfway through the Old Testament. It was their dark ages of the Israel, like at that time. And then Egypt down there. So that kind of gives you an idea. So Abraham starts here in and then he gets called to this place called Haran, and he goes up here. And he lives there until his dad dies. And then God says, hey, I'm going to give you a land, come with me. And he takes them straight south, all the way down here to where Jerusalem is. And he puts them right there, and he says, this is going to be your land. And this is where that Genesis 12 passage comes, and he gives them 3 promises. I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you a nation, and you're going to bless the whole entire world. And Abraham's like, this is awesome, great. And so they move on. Well, to kind of give you an idea then, when they end up in Egypt, they end up down here. Egypt's in two kingdoms at that point. And then when they escape Egypt, here's the interesting thing. I don't know how you picture this in your mind, but let me just show you. When they escape Egypt, they come up here, they leave Egypt, they cross, and then that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness only takes place in like that circle right there. They don't really go that far. Like it's kind of bouncing around. It's just right, like where you put your hand right here is where most of those, like the stories of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, all that plays out right here. Even with Joshua, they just start heading up north a little bit. Isn't that interesting? Here's what I think is fascinating, is that in the Old Testament, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see everybody up here become really, really big kingdoms. They're going to become massive kingdoms, big enough that they can go overtake other smaller kingdoms. And you see them do it because they take over Israel several times. Everybody down here becomes big, big kingdoms. They become massive kingdoms, big enough armies to take over other lands. And you see it because they take over Israel as well. And you have God who places Abraham right here. Look for a second. The physical characteristics of the land. What's different here to here? Or there to there? What do they have? They have rivers. These huge, massive rivers. Do you know what rivers do? Besides provide a place to wakeboard? They provide life. They bring in water, right? They flow. That's what, whenever you hear living water, typically in the Bible, it's usually referring to water that flows. Okay, and where God calls Abraham is where the Dead Sea is, right there, right? And so, or actually right there. But here's the difference: so rivers, when you talk about a people group, it's why every one of our big cities is located on a river, right? It's because when you go there, it actually is a place that provides. You can build wealth near rivers. You know why? Because rivers connect. Rivers bring people together. Rivers allow you to almost start trading with other people, right? I can live down the river, and if you live up the river, guess what? I can float my stuff up and sell you things, and then you can sell me things, and then we can trade language and culture, and we can get recipes, and I can get your recipe book and take it back down, right? I mean, we can do all of those things. And after a little while, once we start making money because it's much easier on a river, we can actually come together and say, hey, we've got some money now. What if we hire a militia and we can start protecting our area? And now we can build an army. And now even bigger, we can kind of grow together and become this bigger society, which means now we can go overtake those other guys that are even further up the river. Rivers make life abundant. They provide. They give us more. Guess where God calls Abraham? Do you know the characteristic of this area right here? It's not rivers. Do you know what it is? Mountains. It's hills and mountains. Do you know what mountains do? Rivers connect, mountains divide. Because when I live on one side of the mountain, you can live on the other side of the mountain, and it's way too hard to get over there. So it's way harder to bring over my stuff to you and sell. It's way harder to connect and to send messages. And it's way harder to things don't come as easy. So it takes a lot more work because mountains divide. That's one of the reasons why when you have the Old Testament and the people of God growing, you have these 12 tribes, and they can almost stay 12 tribes because you have those mountains, I have these mountains, and we'll see you when I see you, right? And so I always think it's interesting that when God sets up his people, he calls Abraham out of abundance into this place that he was always going to have to look for provision. It's like God was putting his people in this place where the more that they needed, the better it was going to be for them. Isn't that interesting? Because let's be honest, today, you and I don't like that idea, right? You and I like the idea of abundance. You and I like the idea of strength. You and I like the idea of having things taken care of and having things, like we don't like to go to an empty shelf at the store, right? We've learned that in the last couple of years. We're not a fan of that. We like things now. We like things to be provided. We like things available. But yet at the end of the day, God calls Abraham to a place that wasn't going to be as abundant as where he could have. If I was God, I won't speak on behalf of you, but if I was God, I would probably lean to calling Abraham to a place that would be a little bit more abundant. Wouldn't you? Maybe? Because then they would have everything that they needed. But that's not what God does. God says, Abraham, follow me. I'm going to take you to a place. I'm going to give you to this land. And I'm going to put you in a place, and here's what I think. I think God puts Abraham in a place where he was always going to have to rely just a little bit more. I think he put Abraham in a place that was never meant to be a gigantic kingdom. Israel was never expected to be this huge kingdom that was going to be bigger than Rome or bigger than Mesopotamia or bigger than Babylon or bigger than Egypt. I think what they were supposed to do was be in an area where they were going to be relying on God more than anybody else around them. And that the more that they relied on God, the more God got to be God to them. Think about that just for a second. The more you and I rely on God, the more God gets to be God to us. But the less we need of God, the less God gets to be God to us. It's one of those things that we can easily agree with, right? Until we have to. Right? Because when those times come and we need him, those are hard places to be, aren't they? When those times come when we feel weak, or we feel like we're in need, we're not always thankful for those moments. We're not always thankful for the moment where we look at God and we say, God, I need you because I don't know what else I'm going to do. God, I need you in my marriage. God, I need you in my finances. God, I need you in my relationship with my kids. God, I need you in my relationship with my parents. Sorry, anybody there? Because we're not always thankful for those moments. But I wonder if at times it's God's gift to us. So then in those places where we need him and we need to rely and we need to depend, God gets to be more God to us. We started this whole talk with this idea of stories. And I'm still fascinated by the fact that when Stephen stands in front of the council, he doesn't start with the, hey, here's Jesus, and he rose from the dead, which is fascinating and insane and an incredible way to understand what God is doing. But instead, he starts back with the full story of who God is and how God has been leading his people through generations and says, this is the God that we're relying on. And he turns over his life that day and gives it up. But I think what we see and what we begin to understand is that God is a God who loves to provide. He's a God who loves to meet us in our need. He's a God who loves to be active and loves to be present with us. But sometimes in our abundance, we forget to rely. I think Jesus leans into this. Do you know Jesus had his famous sermon? He had this famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. He gave it many, many times. The starting of that sermon we call the Beatitudes, and he starts with this, which I always think is a fascinating way to start a sermon, because if I stood up here and started this sermon, you guys would be like, what are we talking about today? But he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Now, how many of us wake up one day and we say, I want to be poor? Does any of us really kind of ever try to embrace that idea of poverty? That's not something that comes naturally to us, right? Typically we want more. But then yet Jesus stands up in his most famous sermon, he looks at everybody and says, hey, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor, the ones who realize they are spiritually in need. Because when we realize we're spiritually in need, guess what? We know exactly what we need and we know where to get it. You know, one of the big differences between being poor and being rich is that when you're poor, you know exactly what you need. And there's no question. Because I know at the very basis, I need food, I need water, and I need shelter. You know what changes when we become rich? We don't really know anymore what we need. Started this morning with this idea of the power of a good story. And I think when life is going on, there's stories that you and I live in. There's story that you and I tell ourselves, and maybe we get trapped in sometimes. And I just have to ask you, what is the stories that we rehearse? Because I love the fact that Stephen, in giving his defense for his life, starts back and says, I'm just going to tell the whole story of God in order to help you understand what's going on here. And I wonder if you and I, when we're in places of need, when we're in places where we need to rely, if our go-to story is that our God is living and active and present and is ready to provide, and he's ready for me to meet with him. Because if it isn't, I think that's the story we need to be rehearsing. That's the story we need to be living into, is that no matter what's going on, we have a God who's here with us and who's ready to work and who's ready to move, and he wants us, in a sense, to need him. because the more that we can rely on him, the more he can provide. And the more glory he gets in this whole thing, which is, I think, is an incredible part of how God sets this whole thing up. You know, I've always thought this was it's a random fact, but I think it's weird that it's always stuck with me. And here it is. Did you know that when Broadway shows start, the rehearsals don't stop? So you have these actors that are doing these shows, and sometimes these actors will they'll do 500 shows if the show is popular, right? And you know what's crazy is they never stop rehearsing. That Tuesday afternoons, you'll find the whole cast there, full makeup, doing the same show, even though they've done it 8 other times in the previous week. Do you know why? It's because they know the show is never done. They know that they need to keep rehearsing those lines in order for the show to become better. Do you know, you and I, as we do life, sometimes we need to rehearse things to make sure that we're getting the right story in our hearts and our lives. You and I need to be rehearsing that we have a God who's good, that we have a God who's active and who's present, because sometimes other stories take that place. Other stories come in and start challenging that. And we forget that God is a God who wants to provide, who wants to meet with us. And so today, I'm just going to pray a simple prayer. That this next week, as God moves and as God works and as we're given chances to rely, we will look up and say, okay, God, I need you. I need you to be bigger than you were yesterday to me, because I know you are. And that no matter what's happening, we'll be able to look up and say, God, I'm just going to rely on you for this because I need wisdom or I need discernment. Or maybe even I'm going to wait before I have that conversation until you give me words, because I need your words, God, to communicate what I need to communicate to this person. I think at the very core of our being, you and I don't like relying. But I think at the core of God's story, the more we rely, the more we get to see God be God. And I think somewhere in that tension is where we need to find ourselves.